Sure. What can I do to help you? I am. Super. Okay. Okay. Sounds good.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the House Committee on Science and Technology. I've got 4 minutes after 10. We're going to start promptly at 5 after, so take about a minute or so and get seated, and we'll get started momentarily. I'd like to thank everybody for being here. My name is Representative Ed Setzler. I'm the chair of the House Committee on Science and Technology. I'd like to thank our members for being here today. If there's anybody here from out of state that's looking on or that's came here from out of town, we are a part-time legislature here in Georgia. So people have sacrificed, the members have sacrificed their business and times out of session to be here today because this is an important subject matter, and I appreciate everybody that came to be with us in the audience as well. We know you made sacrifices to be here for an important issue, so I thank you for that. Our issue today is that of voting technology. I'm going to just talk very briefly here to kind of set this up, and we've got some speakers that are going to be with us today. We have one calling in from the Washington, D.C. area via Skype. They'll be projected up on the board here. So if you're in a place that can't see the screen, you might want to move and locate it so you can see that. If not, the audio should be fine. You should be able to hear it. And then we also have our own state elections director, Mr. Chris Harvey. The reason we're having this hearing is over the course of the last couple years, folks have come to me off and on about the issue of the technology that we use for our voting system. I think we all want to have a system that is best in class and does all the things that technology can provide for us. And that's what this really is about. You know, we were in 2002 on the backside of the Bush v. Gore situation in Florida in 2000. Our Secretary of State, Kathy Cox, as many of you know, kind of took a move that she believed was bold and progressive and forward-thinking to bring in a new technology in Georgia that's been with us for about 15 years now. And in that decade and a half, there's been more technology that's emerged. There's become broad debate about a electronic-only system versus a electronic system that has hardcore paper manual backup. There's discussion about the only thing that a voter perhaps should interact with is paper. There's all kinds of discussion around this. And what we do as the House Committee on Science and Technology is we start out of session frequently and start to look at these things and start to understand what technology-related policies could serve our state well, and that becomes oftentimes a focal point to shape the policy debate and discussion either over the course of months or perhaps even over the course of years. I would note this committee about 4 or 5 years ago started working on the issue of automated vehicles, autonomous driving systems, and that work was instrumental in moving us towards a bill this last session, although it went through the Transportation Committee. It was some of the work that started right here in digging deeper and deeper into the onion, if you will. So we're not just living on the surface with surface opinions and surface facts, but we can really get into the heart of issues. And that's really what we're trying to do today. So I thank you for being here today. There's no formal public discussion as such. There may be a chance to recognize a couple folks at the end, depending on how time allows. So I don't want to, prejudge what that would look like. But I do want to tell you we do have two very strong speakers today. First one's going to be Mr. Jeremy Epstein. He's the Deputy Division Director for Computer Network. Can you guys hear me? Okay. He's the Deputy Division Director of the National Science Foundation. He's a scientist, works for the federal government. He's going to be calling in today. He's actually going to be calling in his personal capacity so that he's not speaking with a formal imprimatur of the foundation, but in his role, that's part of what his responsibilities are. And he'll be our first speaker today, and then we'll be followed up again by Chris Harvey, who's the Director of Elections for the state of Georgia. Georgia's senior election official working for Secretary of State Brian Kemp. So they'll have a chance to make a presentation. There's going to be a chance for significant discussion among the panelists. committee members to have discussion, ask questions. I encourage you to ask questions, take notes, ask hard questions, and let's have some discussion, and let's seek, as we're called to do as a committee, to get to the heart of these issues and understand, are there vulnerabilities in our current system? Are there technologies and opportunities out there that as we transition to new equipment and through new election cycles that perhaps we could do better than we're doing today? That's the question that's before us as a committee. And with that, I'd like to recognize Mr. Epstein. Welcome. Thank you for calling in from your library in Alexandria, Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, can you hit computer audio on your menu?
Computer.
Below the witnesses.
There you go.
Good
Mr.
morning.
Epstein,
Good morning, Keith.
I think we can hear you.
Great, thank you. I am here to echo there. Not sure if there's something to do on the AV side.
We can see you. We can see you very well. Make sure you're talking into the microphone. The mic was coming in and out a little bit as you were talking.
Okay, well, let me try again. Is that better?
Yes, thank you. Much better.
Okay. All right. So, Chairman Setzler and members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you today. I've been living in Virginia for 30 years. I've served on various Virginia legislative commissions as a citizen expert, looking at these very issues that you're looking at. So I applaud you for taking the time to explore these issues. In addition to my professional experience, I'm also the chief poll worker for Precinct 841, Fairfax County, Virginia. So I see the realities of where these voting systems hit the voters and what actually happens. So I think that's given me a unique perspective. As you said, Chairman Setzler, my opinions are my opinions and do not reflect those of the U.S. government or the National Science Foundation. So I'd like to tell you, I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes and then have lots of time for questions, I hope. I'm going to talk to you about three basic areas. I'm going to talk to you about the voting technology, DREs and op scans. I will talk to you about audits. Briefly, your next speaker will be going into that in much more detail, so I'm not going to spend a lot of that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what other states are doing. So the basic types of voting machines in use in the United States today are the DREs, or digital recording electronic voting machines. These are the touchscreen machines that you're very familiar with in Georgia. OpScan or optical scan machines, which are increasingly in use, and that's where pretty much all states are going today. There was a move, as you said, Mr. Chairman, right after the Bush v. Gore situation towards DREs. They were thought to be the wave of the future. As we've learned more, we've discovered that they were not a good wave, but they were what was done in most states. Today, nearly all states have abandoned DREs. There's only, I think, 8 states left that use DREs at all, 8 or 10, I'm not sure exactly. And there's only 5 states, including Georgia, that are exclusively reliant on DREs. The key issue with DREs is that they're completely dependent on the software working correctly. If the software is perfect and there's no bugs, nobody hacks it, DREs are wonderful. But the fact is that DREs are frequently buggy, frequently have security vulnerabilities, and we just don't know how to build perfect software. I hear every so often, well, voting system vendors say, oh, we can build software that won't have any vulnerabilities. And my question to them is, if you're that good at building perfect software, why aren't you helping the banks? Why aren't you helping Equifax because of their huge hack that we all got hit with just a few days ago? Why are you wasting your money, your time, solving small problems when you could be solving the national defense problems of our country? The answer is we don't know how to build perfect software, and that's an unfortunate fact of life today. The voting machines, the DREs in particular, assume there's no physical tampering, but we know they're easily tamperable. One of the most common voting machines in use today can be physically tampered using a hotel minibar key. I'm not sure if it's the one you're using in Georgia, but it's from the same manufacturer. You just take your hotel minibar key, you can open it up, and you can change the memory card, and by changing the memory card, you can change the programming of that voting machine, cause votes to be counted for any candidate that you want, and it'll be undetectable. We've been studying these machines basically since they started in use for about 15 years. And there have been quite a number of studies. There have been studies sponsored by states. California did their top to bottom review. Ohio did the Everest review. And then there have been reviews done by academics. And 100% of the studies of these voting machines have shown that they are vulnerable to security flaws, security attacks. The only question is, has somebody tried? And that's a much harder question to answer. We don't know whether anyone has actually tried to manipulate elections by manipulating these voting machines, but we know they're eminently hackable. I would point you as an example. I don't know if any of you had a chance to review the article I passed along about the win vote study in 2015 that was done by the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's something I had encouraged them to do for many years, and they did it in 2015. And the results of that were so bad that they held a closed-door meeting, and they decertified those machines effective the same day. They didn't give any transition period. They told the localities, of which I think there were about 30 of them at that time, that they could not use them anymore, and so they didn't. They replaced all those voting machines. One of the things that's kind of interesting that's happened over the summer is that both some of those machines from Virginia, the win vote machines, and also machines from other parts of the country that were sold on eBay and GovDeals and other websites like that, a bunch of machines were brought to Las Vegas for a hacker conference that's called DEF CON, which is just like the military term, DEF CON. And what you had is you had a bunch of hackers, none of whom had ever touched a voting machine before. Most of them didn't know how voting machines worked. And we asked, I shouldn't say we, I wasn't part of it, but they were asked, can you manipulate the votes in these voting machines in an undetectable way, having never seen or touched one before? And the answer was, not surprisingly, yes. Within 24 hours, they were able to undetectably change the votes in pretty much all of the voting machines, including, I believe, the ones you use in Georgia. As a reaction to that, or at least I believe it was a reaction to that.
Mr. Epstein, excuse me. So just to clarify, in Vegas, there was a hacker convention, and one of the activities in that convention was, in sort of an offline way, just for purposes of kind of a hacker exercise, can you interject something into a voting system that can tweak the outcomes? And that they sort of did that in a laboratory setting. That's what you're saying?
Exactly, sir. Except I would disagree that it was a laboratory setting, because these folks were doing it in a hotel room. They had much less opportunity than a professional hacker who was, say, sponsored by a nation state would have. They were just doing it as a bunch of folks. Some of them are high school students, some of them are college students, some of them are professionals, but they were just doing it for the fun of it. Yeah. It's pretty shocking. There was nothing actually they discovered that the academics hadn't discovered 10 years ago, but it was kind of cool to watch it happening in real time in Las Vegas. So after that DEF CON experience over the summer, the Commonwealth of Virginia decided to look at the remaining voting machines that were in use in Virginia. Virginia, unlike Georgia, uses different machines in different parts of the state. Each one of the 130-some localities is allowed to pick what kind of machines they want from a list of approved machines. And last week, or maybe it was the week before, I've forgotten, they announced, but they didn't announce the results. And by that, I mean, they held a closed-door meeting, and they decided to immediately decertify every remaining DRE in Virginia, all of the brands that were in use. And we have the gubernatorial election and the House of Delegates election coming up in November, so this is a relatively short notice. But they won't tell the public what it was they found. They just said that it was bad enough that they wanted to get rid of them right away. And this is not a criticism of the State Board of Election. It's more of an attaboy that. But the analogy is, if you got a letter from Ford or from GM or from Toyota saying, stop driving your car right now, no matter what you're doing, it's going to kill you, but we can't tell you how and we can't tell you whether we can fix it. Just stop right now. And that's essentially what's going on. The State Board of Election said, because these voting machines are in use in other states, they don't want the bad guys to know just how easy it is to hack them. And that's sort of a wake-up call for anyone who thought it was only bad guy hackers. When the state looked at them themselves, they discovered just how bad they were. So even if the machines aren't hacked, though, sometimes they're just buggy. There was a case in and by buggy, I don't know if you're familiar with that term. It just means that it has software problems in it, that it doesn't give the right results. So there was an example in Carteret County, North Carolina, I think it was about 10 years ago, I don't have the exact date on the tip of my tongue, where early voting machines started just dropping votes. They lost something in the range of, I think it was 3,000 to 5,000 votes because the machine had run out of memory and was just silently dropping votes. Because it was an early voting for the entire county, they don't know which voters votes were lost. There was nothing to do other than either accept that the votes were lost or rerun the election. Those were their only choices, and they accepted that the votes were lost, and they kept their fingers crossed that they got the right result. There is no evidence that that was hacking. That was just a bug in the software. There was a case in Fairfax County, Virginia, where I live, about 6 years ago, I think it was, where one of the voting machines in one precinct in a school board election reported approximately twice the number of votes as voters who had actually voted. And they could never figure out why. I have a hypothesis, having examined the machine, but I'm not really sure either. Again, there was no way to really know what had happened. They stopped using that particular machine, but they have no idea whether that particular bug exists in other voting machines. That was in the Win votes, so they're no longer in use in Virginia or anywhere else in the country. So that particular bug we don't need to worry about anymore, but this is the sort of thing that can happen. There are many others I could tell you about as well, but
Mr.
I'll
Epstein,
move on.
So just
the fun
for clarity, what was the vote differential that you're referring that case in Alexandria that was no hack, it was a bug, or it was a malfunction? What was the vote differential that was in play there in that particular circumstance?
That was actually Fairfax County, not Alexandria. But the margin of victory was wider than the number of votes. But there wasn't, so even in that case, it wouldn't have swung the election. However, it was just a couple of years after the Virginia gubernatorial election, which had been decided by a margin of about 200 votes. And the number of votes in question on that particular machine was about 700 votes. So although that particular case, it didn't make a difference, had it been the gubernatorial race instead of the school board race, it could have actually made a difference. We don't know, of course, whether it would have, but it could have made a difference. So the bottom line is, with voting computers, we're completely dependent on whoever programs the software decides the outcome. So when you use a DRE, you're outsourcing your decision of who wins the election to whoever wrote the software. Testing software can't really find these sorts of problems if someone is determined to hide. So another thing I know you've been discussing in Georgia is use of what are called VVPATs, voter verified paper audit trails. What these are is when you vote, you get, there's a printout that you can see under a piece of glass that shows who you selected. and you can either push a button that says, yeah, that's right, or no, that's wrong. And this is a great idea, and it turns out it doesn't work. It doesn't work for a couple of reasons. One is the paper that is used in most of these is what's colloquially called toilet paper. It's the same paper that comes out of your gas station credit card machine. If you think about how hard it is to read a gas station credit card slip, and now you multiply that by 1 million voters and 10 contests on the ballot, it's really, really hard to read them and figure out what's going on if you ever need to do a recount. So really cool idea, but it doesn't work. It also turns out that voters don't actually look at the piece of paper, and if they don't look at the piece of paper, it doesn't do any good. So it was a really neat idea, it just doesn't work. Places that are using these VVPATs are getting rid of them because, as I say, they don't work. The irony of the DREs, though, is they were supposed to make things better for voters with disabilities, blind voters, voters with motion limitations, etc. It turns out they don't work very well in that area. I'm not an expert in accessibility. I'm a security expert, but friends of mine who are accessibility experts tell me that they just don't work very well. So the leading technology today is the optical scan machines. It is the best technology. Some people say, why are we going backwards to paper? The answer is it's going forwards. It's not perfect, but it's the best thing we have. Some people say, why don't we use hand-counted paper? The answer is American elections are too complex. We have many contests on the ballot every time we have an election, and it's too hard to count a bunch of things at once. Hand-counted paper works great in countries like the United Kingdom and Israel, where they have very simple ballots, where there's usually just one thing, you're voting for one party or another. But in complicated elections like we have in the US, hand-counted paper just doesn't work effectively. And finally, before I move on to who's using what, I want to comment that I frequently hear, don't worry, these machines are secure because they're not connected to the internet. Well, first of all, that's not true. These machines frequently are indirectly connected to the internet. The programming of these machines may be done over the internet. For example, Kennesaw State was doing the programming for many of the machines in Georgia, and it turns out they were doing that over the internet, according to some of the information that's come out. Even if that weren't the case, I'd remind those of us who have a little bit of gray hair that we used to spread viruses on floppy disks before we used the internet. Saying it's not on the internet, it's secure, it just doesn't pass the sniff test. So let me talk briefly about who's doing what and where and why. So most states, as I said, that were using DREs in the aftermath of Bush v. Gore have now moved to optical scan. There's only 6 states left using all DREs: Georgia, New Jersey, Louisiana, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And there's 3 states that use mostly DREs without a paper trail: Texas, Indiana, and Kentucky. The other 41 states are pretty much entirely on paper or are moving that way rapidly. The main choice you have with paper is, do you have voters mark by hand? Do they color in the circles on the paper with a pencil or a pen? Or do you use what's called a ballot marking device, a BMD? A BMD can be thought of as a very expensive pencil. It's a pencil that marks your ballot for you. The express vote that I know is under consideration in Georgia is an example of a BMD. There are other BMDs. They have the advantage that they don't count the votes, and so we aren't reliant on their software being accurate. They reduce unintended undervotes and overvotes, meaning voters who forget to select a candidate or who select too many candidates. They are much higher cost because you need as many of them as you need DREs. So instead of having one per precinct, as you might if you were only using them for voters with disabilities who need them, now you might need, depending on the size of your precincts, you might need 5 or 10 of these per precinct. And that tends to, well, it certainly increases cost, and it leads to longer lines. The increased cost because you're purchasing them, you're maintaining them, you're storing them, you're moving them around. So it tends to increase the cost a lot. Whether you want to use that or not is a policy question, not a technical question. but it is one to consider the pros and cons. Virginia, and I talk about Virginia because that's where I've lived for the past 30 years. At one point, it was more than 50% DREs. And as I said earlier, those are going away in favor of optical scans. And in my county, Fairfax County, which is an urban county, it's about 1.2 million people and something like 600, 700,000 voters. There's 250 precincts roughly, and each one of them uses one or two of these BMDs, ballot marking devices, and one or two scanners. So relatively little equipment per precinct, and that saves a lot of money. Maryland just switched, I think it was last year, from using all DREs to using all optical scans with BMDs. They're using the same express votes and Diebold DS200, or I'm sorry, Premier DS200 scanners, but they're having everybody vote on using the BMDs, or everyone mark their ballots rather using the BMDs, and then scan using the scanners. And so they're having somewhat more problems with lines than we were having in Virginia.
So, Mr. Epstein, so to clarify, I just want to make sure everyone's with us. The term BMD is a computer touchscreen system where you touch the screen like a computer, in a computer setting, but it produces a physical ballot that the voter then gets to handle and look at and confirm, and that becomes the ballot, essentially. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm glad you explained that because I didn't. That's exactly correct. You get a piece of paper out. In the case of some BMDs, it shows you all of the candidates and shows you which one you selected. In other BMDs, like the express vote, it only shows you the candidates you selected and doesn't show you the candidates you didn't select. And that makes it a little bit harder for voters because they have to know who they could have selected and didn't.
But for purposes of our committee, I just want to understand, and when you use the term DRE, I know you explained it once, but DRE is the system we have in Georgia that's electronic only.
Right.
OptiScan is where you're filling in generally bubbles on a piece of paper. That's then scanned in, much like an SAT form that you fill out would be scanned in and tabulated. And then BMD is you're touching a computer, but it produces a physical ballot. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. And then that ballot is scanned by the same scanner as you would use if you had marked the paper by hand.
Okay, I just want to clarify that for everybody in the audience, for our members.
Great. I really appreciate you clarifying that.
And you've got about 5 more minutes.
Okay. So the key point when you're using optical scan is that you have to do audits after the fact. And I'm not going to talk about audits because your next speaker is. I did want to just make one comment about the express votes. It's not necessarily a problem with all BMDs, but it is a problem with the express votes that you can only have 7 candidates at a time on the screen. This was a problem in Maryland. So if you have election, or if you have contests where you have more than 7 candidates, that can cause problems. So I guess to summarize, the return to voter-marked paper ballots, whether it's by hand or whether it's using a BMD, is the current best practice and the most widely accepted safe voting methodology. When you combine that with auditing, you get a really good result. And if you further combine that with electronic poll books, which I have not talked about, you can basically eliminate lines because you can get voters through very quickly. So technology can be good for some things. It's great for signing voters in. It's bad for other things like counting ballots where there's no paper backup. So the state of the art is paper ballots and using BMDs, certainly for voters with disabilities, and depending on policy decisions and cost decisions for all voters. So thanks very much for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Epstein. Committee members, I know a lot of you were reading some handouts and taking notes. What questions are there? Chair recognizes Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Epstein. And just so for your notes, you had mentioned a little bit about audits. Our next speaker was scheduled to be here from the Colorado Secretary of State's office, but had to cancel last minute. I was wondering if you could briefly talk about audits and the importance of verifying that the system is working.
Right. So optical scan machines are also computers. They make mistakes. They can be hacked. The whole purpose of an audit is a double check, just as we double check our accounting records in a corporation or in the government for that matter, to make sure that everything adds up correctly. Audits, the purpose of an audit is to make sure the machines are behaving correctly. It's not the same as a recount. An audit is a random selection of precincts or ballots. There are different ways to do it, where you compare what the computer said the result was to what hand counting shows the result to be. They're never going to be an exact match if you have hand marking, because some people will do things like they'll circle the name of the candidate instead of coloring in the bubble. And so when you hand count, you sometimes find those that the computer might have missed. But you can determine within a scientifically valid margin of error whether the computer got the right result. The most widely accepted methodology is one called risk limiting audits that was developed by Professor Philip Stark at the University of California, Berkeley, and that's the method they're using in Colorado, which I'm sure Mr. Shulman would have discussed. Pardon me. I'm sorry.
Just a follow-up as well, if you don't mind,
Sure.
Mr. Chairman. You mentioned Virginia going to optical scans. Also, Maryland is 100% optical scans. What's the cost, do you know, of going to an optical scan versus one of these VVPAT type of solutions?
I don't have price quotes from vendors, and I certainly wouldn't want to speak for a vendor. You can think of the cost of a machine as a relatively fixed amount per machine, whether that machine is a scanner or that machine is a DRE with a VVPAT. The difference is if you have DREs with VVPATs, you need a lot more of them per voter. Depending on the complexity of your ballots, you typically need one of those for every 200 to 250 voters. While with optical scans, you need one optical scan machine for roughly every 2,000 voters. So the price of a DRE with a VVPAT and the price of an OpScan are roughly similar, but you need 8 times fewer OpScans. And so you get a lot of savings there. Yes, there's an increased cost of printing the paper, but that cost is pretty much wiped out because you need fewer poll workers to manage the machines. You need less storage space to store the optical scanners than you would with DREs. You have a lower maintenance budget for optical scanners, et cetera. So it comes out a lot cheaper except in very, very small precincts. Very small precincts are the one exception where the DREs with VVPAT economically make sense. In anything other than really small precincts, it saves money to use OpScan.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Rakestraw.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have seen videos of the optical scanning machines where they fill out a few ballots and they run them through and they get a tabulation, and I've seen a lot of errors in that. So are you saying that there's something that's changed or improved in the technology that has lessened that? And if so, what is the margin of error using the optical scans?
Well, I'm not going to be a salesperson for an optical scan vendor, but they are pretty accurate. The newer ones use some better technology for recognizing marks. They can be calibrated. There's also software that you can use after the fact to compare things. But the real metric is the audits. The audits tell you if you've got a problem like that. If you have a DRE and you have a problem like that, you have no idea. It just something weird happened, and after the election you say, I wonder what happened, why we have so many fewer votes here than we had there. With optical scan, you actually have something you can look at, you can audit, and you can say, I understand voters were confused, voters loved all the candidates, voters hated all the candidates, whatever. You actually have something you can figure out, do a forensic investigation.
Okay, thank you.
Chair recognizes that Representative Gilligan, 25. Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to explore a little bit about the indirect connectivity to the internet with these DREs. Could you sort of go into that a little bit? You'd mentioned that we're often told that these systems are not connected to the internet, and could you explore that with us a little bit?
Sure. The specific details are going to differ from one voting machine brand to another, but in general, the idea is that an attacker they could come in from a number of different vectors. They might attack the voter registration system and install malicious software through the voter registration system, which then spreads as a virus into the programming for the voting machines. In the case of what appears to be happening through Kennesaw State, the attacks could be directly into the the ballot programming system over the internet. And once that malicious software is installed over the internet into that ballot programming, it gets copied to the individual voting machines and manipulates the elections in the individual voting machines. So that's sort of one vector, is it comes in from the top down, as it were. Another vector is from the bottom up. If someone gets access to one voting machine and manipulates one voting machine, changes the software on that one, the removable media, the removable memory cards like SD cards, like you might use in your camera, get copied back to a central voter tallying system, and the virus could get copied on that and then redistributed to the other voting machines. These have been demonstrated in laboratory experiments, how to do this sort of thing. So we know how to do it. It was also demonstrated at the DEF CON experiment in Las Vegas that I mentioned. Somebody showed how you could do this. It's the sort of technology that's, it's not something that could be done by, say, a high school hacker, but someone with a college degree in computer science would probably be quite capable of developing something like that if they were willing to go to jail for it.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Epstein, to clarify, the circumstances you're talking about, there's no case where that's happened. You're simply talking about potential to enter a system through these different, as you said, these vectors. These are ways that, in essence, we've got to be perfect at preventing to keep it from happening. But you're not suggesting there's been any proven example of that in a specific election, correct?
That's correct. I have no reason to believe this has happened in any election. I've heard no one reputable discussing any potential that this has happened in a real election. On the other hand, if it has happened, someone who was reasonably skilled would have done it in a way that would be undetectable, and some of the laboratory experiments have shown that. So there would be no way we would have known, but I have no reason to believe it has happened. In the case of the WinVote machines that were in use in Virginia, I was widely quoted as saying, if nobody broke into them, it's because nobody tried, and I believe that's the case here as well. If nobody has manipulated an election like this, it's because nobody tried. That doesn't mean it's happened. It just means nobody's tried.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Representative Gilligan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did have a question about the technology. You had made the comment that a DRE with a VVPAC could handle 200 to 250 voters, but you could do almost tenfold with the optical scan. What is it about the technology that allows you to handle so many more voters through an optical scan?
I'm sorry. The difference is that in the case of optical scan, assuming you're doing optical scan where voters are using a pencil or a pen to mark the paper, if you just need more privacy booths with cardboard booths or clipboards or whatever. So you can have lots of people marking their ballots at the same time. And the only time they need to interact with a machine is when they're finished marking all their circles and they go over and they scan the machine. And it's basically like making a photocopy. It takes a few seconds and you're done. By contrast with the DREs, the voter has to be standing in front of that DRE while they're making all their decisions. So if they walk into the voting booth not having decided who they're planning to vote for, they can spend 10 or 20 minutes staring at the machine trying to decide why, and that means that machine is tied up for the entire time. While if they walk into the voting booth not having decided who they're voting for and it's a piece of paper, they can sit there as long as they want, and it's not tying up any machines, it's just tying up that pencil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes Representative Perkle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Epstein, with your background, this is Representative Perkle in South Georgia. With your background, are you at all concerned with people revoking your geek card with your statement, the state of the art involves a number 2 pencil and a piece of paper for our elections? Is there, Representative Gilligan asked one of the questions I had was as far as the number of optical scanners that be required. But is there a time difference in getting election results with fewer optical scanners, but they do go through very, very fast in reading? Is there much of a time difference that you've noticed?
So I'll tell you what I've experienced as a poll worker in Fairfax County, Virginia. Again, I'm not speaking for Fairfax County. I'm just telling you my experience. And my experience as a poll worker is it's faster with the optical scans at the end of the day. When we in Virginia open our polls at 6 a.m. and run till 7 p.m., everyone's tired. One of the great things about the optical scans is it generates a piece of paper that says who voted for each candidate, and then I just have to call those numbers in. When we were using the DREs, I would have to generate that total from each DRE, add the numbers up either using a calculator or by hand, and I don't know about you, but after I've been doing this for 12 hours, I'm exhausted and I made mistakes. So I got it done faster and with fewer errors once we switched to op scans. So as a poll worker, I love the op scans.
Okay. And follow up, Mr. Chairman? Thank you so much. In your personal opinion, divesting yourself from any other, in your personal opinion, would it be fair to say that our best bang for buck in terms of dollar expended on elections with the knowledge that the results are accurate would be the optical scanners?
Absolutely, and I think there was a study a number of years ago asking computer scientists broadly about this very question, and something like 95% of computer scientists agreed with this. So going back to your comment about losing my geek credentials, when 95% of computer scientists are willing to lose their geek credentials in favor of a pencil, I think you've got a pretty overwhelming view that we all feel this way. It is the most secure and the most cost-effective way is optical scan combined with BMDs, ballot marking devices for voters with disabilities.
Thank you very much.
Any further questions from members of the committee? I do. Chair recognizes Representative Oliver.
Forgive me for this very basics, but I have not exactly understood yet how the voter actually manages the optical scan and the BMD. Physically, when the voter comes in, I understand direct recording electronics, obviously, because that's how I can punch. What is the mechanics of the optical scan machine?
Sure, that's a great question, and I apologize that I skipped over that in the interest of getting into more of the geeky details. Again, it's going to depend on the particular model, but I'll use the express vote as an example because that's the one I'm most familiar with, and that's also the one I know you're considering in Georgia. When the voter signs in, presents his or her ID or whatever the mechanism is, the poll worker gives them a blank piece of paper, essentially. It's a particular type of paper that's been coded in a particular way. They take that piece of paper, which is it's a 4.5 by 11, so it's half the width of a standard piece of paper and the same length as a regular piece of paper, or it can be, there's longer versions available if necessary too. They take that piece of paper, they go over to the BMD, the ballot marking device, they slide that piece of paper into a slot in there, and then a touch screen comes up and they choose the candidates they want just the way they would on a DRE. When they get a summary screen that shows this is who you've selected and the races, the contests you have not selected, and so on. They push a button, it prints those selections on the piece of paper and spits the piece of paper back out again. The voter now has an opportunity to look at the piece of paper, make sure that the piece of paper has the candidates they wanted. As I said, in the express vote, it only shows the candidates they voted for. It does not list the candidates they did not vote for. The presuming, well, let's say for a second that is a correct summary of what they wanted. They then go over to the optical scanner and they put it in, they slide it in, just the same way as they would have slid in a hand-marked piece of paper, and it scans it and counts the votes and drops that piece of paper into the ballot box for future auditing and recounting. If the voter looks at the piece of paper that's spit out by the BMD and decides, oops, I made a mistake, or the machine made a mistake, either one, they go to a poll worker, they say to a poll worker, I want to void this, and the poll worker, again, depending on the laws of the state, will mark it void or rip it up or whatever and give them a new blank piece of paper. They go back to the BMD and they do it again.
That's very helpful. That's very helpful. But the mechanics you've just described for me are essentially a touch screen to put the mark on the piece of paper that's been fed into it.
Right. That's why I call it a very expensive pencil.
I got confused by there. So it's not a pencil, it's still a touch screen. And at the end of the day, the machine is counting the votes, not counting the piece of paper. Am I correct?
So the BMD doesn't count anything. The BMD just makes the marks on the piece of paper. The scanner counts the votes.
A machine counts the votes, not you as a poll worker. The machine counts the votes for the day.
Right, and that's why you need auditing, because you need to make sure that the machine counted the votes correctly.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
And to clarify, the BMD would also, in a particular precinct, there are multiple ballot combinations because there could be a school district, one voter might have one school board member but a different state representative. So the BMD has within it the different ballot combinations, and when a particular voter comes up, it knows what your options are to vote. So it gives you that, correct?
Right. So exactly the same way as in a paper ballot situation, the poll worker would have a stack of the version A choices for people in this district, and they'd have a stack of version B ballots for people in the other district in exactly the same way. If you use a BMD, it knows about both version A and version B. And when the poll worker shows the voter how to use the BMD, the poll worker will push the A or the B for the voter, so the voter gets the correct choices.
So the ballot combination information that our current systems have is preserved in a BMD setting. So a voter you can't have a mistake of giving someone the wrong ballot. It's got to the extent the system's not been hacked, like today, that BMD system knows who Ed's voting for. Paulette perhaps has a different set of school board members she's voting for, but the system knows that. And then when I vote, it marks the paper for me, and then I vote, essentially I put it through an OptiScan just as if I had filled out a bubble ballot. Is that correct?
That's correct, except the only thing is the BMD doesn't know who you as a person are entitled to vote for. The BMD doesn't know who you as a person are. It knows about the version A and version B, but it doesn't know that you as an individual, which one you're doing. It just knows that the poll worker selected an A or a B.
Gotcha. Okay. Any questions on that point?
And that's important from a privacy perspective, that the BMD shouldn't know who you are. If I could make one other comment that's sort of related to that, there are a couple of places in the country that are experimenting with new generations of technology beyond what we have today. Los Angeles, California is building their own voting system, and their system looks pretty much like a BMD with an optical scanner. The main difference is that it has an integrated ballot box in the BMD. So the BMD prints the votes, and then if the voter pushes the OK button, it drops it into a ballot box. And that doesn't require physical touching, and that makes it easier for voters with motor disabilities who wouldn't be able to pick up a piece of paper. So it has that advantage. And they've done a terrific job in studying all the different requirements. And they have some unique requirements in Los Angeles because of all the different languages that are spoken. The other sort of bleeding edge example is in Travis County, Texas, Austin, Texas, where they're using some new mathematical technology to be able to prove that the results counted correctly, which has advantages from an auditing perspective.
Chair recognizes Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's not so much a question, but a statement, and I think what I'm getting from you, Mr. Epstein, is this is not just about the technology, but you have to have process around voter security. You have to have process around when the voter shows up. You have to have a process around the audit trail and actually engage in those activities. These are things that we currently do not have in place in Georgia, and other states are finding that the process is just as important as the technology as well. I know that you and I have had conversations about Virginia does not have the mandatory requirements for audits, but Colorado does. Can you address some of the problems you see in Virginia versus Colorado because of the differences in process?
So you're absolutely right, Representative. The process is a big part of it. Everything from how do you hire your poll workers, how do you physically send equipment to the polling place, how do you physically lock up the ballots at the end of the day and make sure that they're not tampered with and the boxes aren't replaced. There are many, many, many areas of process that are absolutely critical, and as a computer scientist, I rely on others to get that stuff right. But you have to get it all right. It's people, it's process, it's all of that. Excuse me. In terms of the difference between Colorado and Virginia, until about a year ago, it was actually illegal to do a post-election audit in Virginia, which is kind of mind-blowing. The law said that you could only do a post-election audit if every contest on the ballot had been decided by at least a 10% margin, and only after the results were all finished. So when it didn't matter was the only time you could actually audit. There's a new law that has not yet gone into effect. It goes into effect summer of 2018 that allows for audits. But Virginia has not yet figured out how those audits are going to work. That was delegated by the legislature to the State Board of Elections, and they have not shared, to my knowledge, any plans. So Colorado is way ahead. They've developed great processes, and they're putting them into place. And I think they've used them in a couple of elections. Everyone is sort of learning about this. It's a fairly new idea. To be doing it on a routine basis. About half the states have audits in one form or another. Kentucky is kind of an interesting example. In Kentucky, by law, you have to audit the ballots, and there's a certain percentage that you have to audit by law. But because Kentucky mostly uses DREs without VVPAT, there's nothing actually to audit, so it's not clear how they're complying with the law.
Chair recognizes Representative Gilligan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of questions, if it's okay. In following up with your answer to Representative Oliver, you used the example of the express vote, but earlier you had also mentioned that the express vote can only show 7 names on the screen at a time. So when we're doing a presidential preference primary or some of our other big primaries, we would have more than 7 names on the ballot. That puts, I would assume, the people at the bottom end of that, the last of the alphabet, at a disadvantage to those who happen to be the first 7 names you get to see. Is that a true question or assumption?
So the way the express vote, and again, I'm only talking about the express vote, it isn't necessarily true of other BMDs, and there could be a software update to the express vote that might resolve this problem. But the way that it was done in Maryland, and the reason Maryland is currently only using one BMD per precinct, even though their plan is to have all voters use BMDs. The reason they did it is because they had more than 7 candidates in a contest. And so what you get is you get the first 7 on the screen, and then at the bottom it says something like see more or next or something. I don't remember what the wording is. And so the voter has to push that button to see the next set of candidates, and then they can go back and forth. So if we're having a presidential preference poll, voters might go back and forth. But we know from human factor studies by psychologists that voters are frankly lazy. They pick things near the top, whether it's elections or whether it's catch-up. They pick the things that they see close to the top. And so if you're further down in the list, you're disadvantaged in terms of getting votes. And so especially if you're not in that top 7, you're gonna be in trouble.
And then one more follow-up, if I may, sir. You also mentioned, of course, the piece of paper, and it only prints out, actually I have 2 questions, but it only prints out the names that you actually voted for. So in some elections, some people don't vote for the judge, or they don't vote for the school board, or whatever it is, that they skip that. Would they even realize that they had skipped it? In other words, would they see that there was a judge that they could have voted for, but they just have a blank? Or is it that entire thing is missed? And the reason I'm asking is because when you have so many names on the ballot and so much down ballot, it's easy for a person to forget that there was a judge and they wanted to vote, but they didn't realize that they missed it.
That's a really good question. I'm not sure of the answer. I believe, but I'm not positive, that it would print the name of the contest and not show any selection underneath. But I haven't actually seen that for sure. I'll have to play with that the next time I have a chance. So I don't want to give you a definitive answer.
Well, thank you.
Was there another piece of the question that I missed? I'm sorry.
Well, now, because I asked my question, I can't remember the other question I had, so, and I didn't get it all written down.
And
But
you still have the floor. You have the floor.
7 names on it. Oh, then you had talked about some precincts would have perhaps a combination of a BMD and an optical scanner, where I'm actually using a real physical pencil with a real physical piece of paper, and I'm marking my ballot. So I walk into a precinct, and I think that I want to have the foolproof, the machine picking the name for me. I don't have to be disabled or anything. I just want that machine actually marking my ballot. So I could go do that. But if I use the piece of paper, could you step me through that process where I'm actually using a physical pencil, physical paper, marking my ballot, then going to a scanner?
Sure. So whether you as a non-disabled voter can use the BMD or not is a matter of policy. It's not a matter of technology. So I'm not going to say whether you can or can't do that. In Fairfax County, where I'm a poll worker, anyone who requests to use it, the answer is yes. Of course, you may use it if you want. For the voters and the vast majority of voters in my precinct, do the hand-marked paper. Even frankly, I've had blind voters who choose not to use the BMD, even though it would provide audio input and allow them to mark the ballot themselves. They would prefer to have a friend or a spouse help them. do a paper ballot. But for those people who for whatever reason use the paper ballot, the hand-marked paper ballot, it just looks, as the chairman said, like an SAT score sheet. It has the names of the candidates, or it's the same as you get in an absentee ballot, and you just, depending on the brand of machine, you color in the circle next to the name of the candidate you want. Well, I'm sorry, I should back up, because you asked what the full process was. After the voter presents their ID, if IDs are required in your state, the poll worker gives them a ballot, typically inside a manila envelope or a manila folder to protect their privacy. They go into a booth, which in our case is a cardboard box sitting on a table with a chair, and they use a pencil or a pen to color in the circles for the candidates they want. When they're satisfied of what they've done, they take that ballot, they put it back in the manila folder, they carry it over to the optical scanner, and they slide it into the scanner, which reads the selections. It will warn them if they have overvoted, if they've selected too many candidates for some contest. In general, you don't program the scanner to reject undervotes. It's technically possible, but it's not usually done. And the reason is that, for exactly the reason you stated, Representative, that a lot of voters choose not to vote on the down ballot races. And so if it rejected anyone who skipped a down ballot race, it would be rejecting every ballot. But it'll scan, it'll make sure that you don't have overvotes. If you have overvotes, it will ask you, do you want to cast the ballot anyway, even with an overvote, meaning that none of the votes would count for that contest, or do you want to try it again? If the voter didn't have any overvotes, or if the voter says they wanted to cast it even with overvotes, it drops the ballot in the paper ballot into a ballot box that's locked up, and then the voter is done. If the voter did overvote and wants to try again, it gives them the paper ballot back. It spits it back at them, and the voter then goes to a poll worker and says, I'd like a new ballot. Again, depending on the state law, they might mark it void, they might tear it up. You get a new paper ballot, and you start over from the beginning.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Any further questions for Mr. Epstein? Hearing none, Mr. Epstein, would you like to close briefly for us? I appreciate your time being with us today. I think it's been very informative. You might spark another question or two. That's the risk you take by saying anything else. But I just give you a moment or two to close for us.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. I really do enjoy these sorts of opportunities to talk with experts in your field. I'm an expert in my field. You're an expert in your field, and talking together is important to solving the problems, and I do appreciate the opportunity. I'd like to emphasize that the pretty much unanimous view of computer science experts is that paper optical scan is the technology of the future. It's also cost saving, and it saves time. So it's kind of a win-win in all respects. And I hope to hear soon that Georgia is making that shift. And if I can be of any further assistance in the future, I welcome any of you to reach out to me.
And we've got Mr. Epstein's contact information if anybody would like to reach out to him personally. So we'll be glad to share that through the committee process. And Mr. Epstein, I thank you so much for your time this morning.
My pleasure.
I've got about 8 minutes after 11. As many of you know, our next scheduled speaker, Mr. Dwight Shulman, from the Elections Division of Colorado, has called yesterday and said he was not going to be able to make a presentation today, unfortunately. So I'm disappointed to hear that. He really is a national expert on the technology. The intention with Mr. Shulman was that in Colorado, they're a state who've been where we are and are out there implementing some of these, not just from the perspective of potential, but what's being done today in practice in Colorado. They had 3 counties. They had an election blow-up issue. In fact, I called the Secretary of State's office last night. I was talking to him about 6 p.m. the person I was speaking to went in and talked to Secretary of State briefly and just confirmed they didn't have a person that could speak today. So we regret that we're going to miss Mr. Shulman. He really is, really, with the words of Mr. Epstein and others, a national expert in this. And our goal with him was just what's being done by states who've kind of been through this process, that have kind of done the pure electronic thing and have taken a step towards new but physically verifiable technology, and they're in their second generation of physically verifiable technology. That was really the goal today, was to hear that. So it's regrettable he's not going to be with us today, unfortunately. He was going to come in by Skype as well. We do, though, however, after a break, we're going to hear from Mr. Chris Harvey. He's the elections director for the state of Georgia. This will put us ahead of our schedule a little bit. We had 45 minutes scheduled for Mr. Shulman. So what I'm going to do is I've got 10 after 11. We're going to take a 10-minute break. Members, take a biology break if you need to. Recharge your coffee cup, get water, visit the restroom if you need to. By my watch, it's 10 after exactly. At 20 after, we're going to start with Mr. Chris Harvey. So we're going to stand in recess for 10 minutes. we'll get started. Welcome back. Thank you again for being here. This is the House Committee on Science and Technology. Picking back up after a short recess, Chair would like to recognize Mr. Chris Harvey. Mr. Harvey is the Director of Elections for the Office of the Georgia Secretary of State. He has generously agreed to be here with us. I will say this. Many of you may know that the state of Georgia is in a lawsuit. A suit's been brought by some plaintiffs about our election system. So, you know, and I just want to say this for everybody that's here. I think it's a stand-up thing to do for our Secretary of State's office to come here and testify publicly when they're being sued. Attorneys would normally say, don't come. You could say something that could be construed or used in court against the state or the Secretary of State's office. So, Mr. Harvey, I'd like to thank you for being here. In my conversation with Mr. Harvey, he just wants to really get the facts out there and recognize that Secretary of State cares deeply about this issue, it's a conversation that we need to be having. And I appreciate you for your openness and for your being here. And with that, Mr. Harvey, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got an opening statement to read, and then I'll be happy to respond to questions. Chairman Setzler and members of the House Science and Technology Committee, my name is Chris Harvey, and it is my honor and privilege to serve Secretary of State Brian Kemp and the citizens of Georgia as the election director for the Georgia Secretary of State's office. It is also my honor to appear before you this morning to answer your questions about voting in Georgia. By way of background, I grew up in Dunwoody, Georgia. In 1989, I earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science with a specialization in criminal justice from the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina. After attending graduate school and then teaching high school for several years, I returned to my home county and joined the DeKalb County Police Department in 1994. I served as a police officer and homicide detective for the DeKalb County Police Department for 5 years before being hired by the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office, where I continued to work homicide investigations before being appointed the chief investigator. I then worked for several years as the director of cold case homicide investigations for the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. In 2007, then Secretary of State Karen Handel hired me as the chief investigator for the Georgia Secretary of State's office, where I expanded the role of the investigative division in election investigations. I served in the role of chief investigator until July of 2015, when I was appointed election director by Secretary Kemp. As the election director, I work with a dedicated team of 16 in the elections division. They're dedicated to serving our 159 county election and registration offices and our entire population of voters and potential voters in this state and also scattered throughout the country and the world as armed forces service members and overseas citizens. Our office is composed of county-specific liaison election specialists, a military and UOCAVA election liaison, a system and assistant system manager, a statewide training coordinator, an election-specific attorney, an assistant director, and several other operational staff members. In addition, our office contracts with the Center for Election Systems at Kennesaw State University and is in the process of moving those operations back into the Secretary of State's office. The Center for Election Systems provides service to our statewide voting system. Of course, elections happen at the local level. Votes are cast and counted in our 159 counties. Voters are registered and voter registrations are kept and maintained at the county level. I'm also here to let you know that our 159 counties, we have dedicated and competent election officials, registrars, probate judges, poll workers, and many other people who work day in and day out to make sure that Georgians are registered to vote and provided every legal opportunity to cast their ballots. It is my responsibility to coordinate elections and voter registration to the state level, but the true heroes in the world of elections are the county-level election workers who work every day to prepare for and conduct elections, and the poll workers that serve their communities on election day. In the last 2 years, our office has specifically recruited armed forces veterans and high school students and college students to get involved in local elections as poll workers. It has never been easier to register to vote or to vote in Georgia. Options for voter registration include online voter registration, registration through the Department of Driver Services, the GA Votes app, and traditional voter registration drives. Voting, too, has never been easier in our state. With 45 days of no excuse needed voting by mail, 3 weeks of advanced in-person absentee voting before elections, and 12 hours on Election Day, voters have multiple options. I'd point out that in 2016, Georgia set new records in numbers of ballots cast in both the presidential preference primary and in the general presidential election. I look forward to this opportunity to share information about voting in Georgia with this committee. I'll do my best to answer your questions. However, should I be unable to answer specific questions, I can respond and provide additional information after this meeting. Finally, as our office is currently involved in litigation over issues involving our voting system, there might be questions that I need to defer answering in light of the current litigation. Thank you for allowing me to offer these preliminary thoughts, and I look forward to answering your questions. I would also point out there were some questions that were asked about the express vote that's being tried in a pilot project in November. I actually went out and tested that system, so if you have any specific questions about that, I'd be able to address those as well. So thank you for your attention.
Mr. Harvey, thanks for being with us today. I would direct members of the committee to think about perhaps the facts shared by Mr. Epstein and some of the contentions he made about this system versus that system, pros and cons, what's working well, what's perhaps not worked well. And then again, Mr. Harvey is here with us today to be able to answer questions about how it applies in Georgia, perhaps even what Georgia is considering and would consider. So with that, Chair will recognize Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey, for being here today. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
I wanted to break down a little bit about the process, if you're able to, and if you can, we understand. What are the methodologies that are in place today for auditing election results using our current machine and technology?
Currently, there are not specific audit results as described by Mr. Epstein. There are certain redundancies that are in place in our system that provide something of an audit, and I don't want to necessarily confuse it as an audit. For example, the electronic voting system we use is backed up by paper. It's backed up by paper in the sense that you've got voter certificates, you've got voters lists, you've got express poll books. So for example, if you had a polling place with 500 voters and somehow, and this has not happened by the way, but somehow 5,000 votes ended up on the DREs, you'd have an immediate, and it's done at every precinct and every polling place for every machine, a reconciliation to say, okay, how many ballot access cards were issued, how many voters, voted on the machines, and do the numbers balance out? So if we end up with 500 votes cast on a machine, we should have 500 voter certificates. We should have the paperwork that backs it up. It's not as complete as an audit as Mr. Epstein was describing, but you do have that. You also have a requirement that the number of registered voters be compared to the number of votes cast to make sure that you don't have an excess that would be unexplainable. But that's about it for now.
Do you have any examples anywhere in Georgia where the number of ballots cast didn't match the people who actually showed up?
Not that I'm aware of, no, sir. Well, no over, certainly, no, sir.
Mr. Epstein made a fairly bold statement. He said that 100% of studies have shown that any DRE machines are hackable. 100% of every study that's ever been done has shown that the machines and technology that we're currently using is a hackable system. When you hear something like that, what's your reaction?
Well, I also heard him say that I think just about any system can be hacked. My reaction, though, is concern. I take the security and the accuracy of the voting system, place it at very high esteem and take it very personally. And it makes me dedicated to doing everything we can with our system now, with our operations now, to make sure that we make it as secure as possible, we make it as difficult as possible for anybody to interfere with our system. And to date, we have not had any indication that anything like that has happened. I think Mr. Epstein talked a little bit about, procedures, and I think one of the committee members asked about procedures, and he emphasized the importance of the procedures, how you treat voters coming in, and how you secure everything. Georgia has pretty extensive regulations and state election board rules, some laws that deal with how that process is to be handled, which again provides security. So the short answer to your question is it concerns me that something is hackable, that anything is hackable, and it ignites me, I suppose, to do everything we can to make sure that that doesn't happen.
I certainly share that ignite sentiment. If we were going to do a recount today, how would we know if there was an actual malfunction with a machine? What are some of the metrics you might use to determine that?
There are a couple things you can do. A recount is essentially reloading the memory cards from the machine. So I guess it depends on what kind of problem you're talking about. When you do a recount with the DREs, you take the memory cards, you reinsert them in the GEM server, and you retabulate the results. In addition, the DREs themselves retain I guess what's called a ballot image on each machine in the memory. So if there was some discrepancy, you could actually go back and audit and see the screen of each ballot that was cast. You could compare that to the totals and see if that matched up.
So you say you could. Is this a process that's currently in place?
It's not in place now, no, sir.
Thank you. That's all I have for now, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Representative Oliver.
Thank you. Mr. Epstein also said that, if I'm remembering correctly, there was no evidence that any voting had been hacked. Do you believe that's true for Georgia? Do you believe?
Absolutely.
Explain to me what the express voting experiment will look like and how it will be mechanically presented to the voter.
Okay. In the city of Conyers, we're doing a pilot project with the express vote. And as Mr. Epstein explained, from a distance, it will look very much like the first half of voting will look very much like the way people vote now. You'll go in, you'll check in with the staff, they'll check your ID, and whereas now you get a yellow plastic voter access card, that card has the precinct information. It doesn't have any voter information, but it has your ballot information on it. And that's why if you have a precinct where you've got school district 2 and school district 3 in different ballot combinations, they make sure that you get the one that's assigned to you. Instead of getting that yellow card, you'll get a piece of paper, as he described, that's about the size of a number 10 envelope. And it's got micro printing on it. And you walk up to the ballot marking device, which looks very much like the DREs that we use. You'll insert the piece of paper into the machine. It sucks it up like a copier. And it'll have the same type of instructions that you see on a DRE, how you mark this, how you do this.
This sounds like the optical scanner machine he was describing.
That's exactly what he was describing.
Okay,
Yes,
so.
And you would make your selections. It would print out the thing. In this case, he was unsure. In this case, if you do not mark a race, it will not show anything. It'll show your selections. However, when you're making your selections on the screen, if you overvote or undervote, it will tell you. It will alert you and say, hey, you can vote for one more person or you voted for too many people. But you then take your printed thing out, and it's got barcodes on it, but it also has specific candidate names or answers to questions. So Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, whatever, you can see that, verify it. You take it over to a large scanner, you scan it in, and the paper is retained in the bottom of the receptacle, and the vote is tabulated on a jump drive, like a memory card.
By the machine?
By the machine, yes, ma'am.
So this is the exact system he was describing that I think I now understand. Based on this experiment in Conyers, what is the Secretary of State's next plan in relation to possibly adopting an optical scan machine process in Georgia?
Well, as Chairman Setzler said, we're beginning the conversation. We're beginning to look at some of the possibilities. We're looking at this system. We're looking at other systems that are similar. And there are several different systems that are very similar to this. There are slight differences, but they do basically the same thing. So we're looking at some of those. And I think what's going to be important is that as we move forward as a state, Obviously, the legislature is going to be critical in any changes that are made, largely because a lot of what we do is mandated by state law.
The timetable for this does not relate to the 2018 session, I'm guessing. Would it relate possibly to 2020, depending on your recommendation, depending on budgeting, or do you have an opinion?
Well, I've got an opinion. I think that if the decision were made on all fronts to go forward with this, I think it's the thing that is possible to be achieved by 2020.
Okay.
It would require, of course, substantial money. It would require some legislative change. It would require, training, procurement process, all that stuff. But I think it's something that's possible to be achieved by 2020 if we start early.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask one final question? I apologize for this. I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no reason for us to believe that we're going to have another HAVA Act that's going to give us billions of dollars to pay for anything before now in 2020.
I don't think there's a thought that there would be anything along that scale. There may be some, I believe there's an amendment that's been tagged on to a defense spending by Senator Graham and Klobuchar that may be talking about some security issues, but I don't think people are anticipating the type of block grants that came in 2002.
Do you personally support a new voting system for Georgia?
I support an accurate, verifiable voting system. I have confidence in our system now, but I also understand that time moves forward, and it's important to adapt. It's important to improve, and so I would never be one. I hope I would never be one to say that I don't support improving something if it's possible. It would be like I said, it would be a team effort. But I wouldn't stand in the way of progress. I wouldn't be opposed to progress.
Chair recognizes 25. Is that Representative Spencer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions, if you don't mind, to ask Mr. Harvey. Can you give us an overall estimate of how much it would cost to change Georgia's system if we move to this new optical scan system that we're currently exploring right now?
And before you answer the question, let's define our terms. There's the OptiScan system where you fill out bubble charts with a pencil and scan them, and there's the BMD system that he described. And that can you frame your question around one of those two?
The Conyers pilot program that you're going through right now, that's the express vote marketing system. If we were to move over to that system, which is what was described by Mr. Epstein, what would be that cost to the state versus our current cost now to maintaining this current system, DRE system?
Obviously, we'd have to do a lot of research and a lot of procurement process, stuff like that. But our best estimate at this point is it'll be in excess of $100 million.
Okay. And going to the current law in Georgia, what does our law say in terms of specific mandates in terms of electronic voting systems? Is there language in statute that says you shall use an electronic system? What does the current law say about that? And can you foresee of any changes if we move in that direction, what that change would look like potentially in terms of a legislative?
397.3 essentially says thou shalt use DREs.
Okay.
And you could there are lots of definitions that would have to be changed. There's not a great the system we're looking at now and what Mr. Epstein talked about is really kind of a hybrid system. The optical scan systems that are talked about in Georgia law are generally the SAT type things, the hand marked with the number 2 pencil. That is covered under Georgia law. But it would probably be advisable to create new legislation around new technology. How you deal with problems, how you deal with something that appears to be marked improperly. I mean, having worked in elections and investigations for 10 years, somebody's always able to find the exception and try to find a law that fits the exception or how a law applies to the exception. So I think it would be important to look at legislation across the board if you're talking about going into that. And but right now, the legislature said we will use DREs.
Okay, I got a couple more questions, Mr. Chairman. Kind of moving to the the issue of the critical infrastructure designated by the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama. His Secretary of Homeland Security included in a regulation or in a letter that our designation, our election systems would be considered national critical infrastructure. What is the progress on that at this point with trying to not include Georgia's election system, for that matter, any state's election system, as part of national critical infrastructure under the U.S. Patriot Act? Where are we with the current administration?
I'll answer to the extent that my knowledge allows me to. The Department of Homeland Security is beginning to set up committees that will deal with the critical infrastructure designation. There have not been many specifics provided as to what that means. They've sort of thrown a blanket over the election system and said this is critical infrastructure. There have been very, very few specifics about what that means and what is going to be covered. I don't believe, I don't know how any individual state could exempt themselves from critical infrastructure. But I have to say that's about the extent of my knowledge on it. I know that they are, like I said, they're beginning to set up coordinating committees. I was at a conference just a month or two ago, National Association of Election Directors, where we were talking about some of that, but they're really just beginning to get the process going now. So I'm sure that more information from that will be forthcoming.
And is it your opinion of your current knowledge of that issue, is the federal government moving forward and continuing to bring in our election systems as national infrastructure? Is that the move at this point? Is that the posture they're in?
It's my understanding that the current administration is continuing the designation of election systems as critical infrastructure. I don't know exactly what you mean by bringing our election systems into that. The general expression from Department of Homeland Security has been that they don't want to get micromanaging with election systems. So but again, that has yet to be determined.
Okay. Last question, Mr. Chairman. And based on sort of what I'm hearing right now, has there been any major issues with Georgia's election system? Serious issues at this point?
There have not been. I mean, we spent, if you look at, go back to June of this year, we had the most expensive congressional House race ever conducted, with a lot of national coverage. I didn't hear anything about the voting system. I didn't hear anything about problems with the voting system.
Okay. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Representative Gilligan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also have about 2 or 3 questions, if that's okay, sir.
To the members, when I recognize you have the floor, so
Okay.
I'll stop you if you're going too long. So you got the floor.
Okay. So thank you again for being here, but I was curious, you were describing the process of what you have in Conyers, Georgia going on. And so I want to know, what is the process in the Secretaries of State office to evaluate all the different, whether it's a BMD or an optical scan, what is the process to evaluate these various systems?
Well, we've just started looking at different systems, and it's going to combine everything. I mean, obviously, anything is going to have to be certified by the Election Assistance Commission. So you've got some basic benchmarks that everything is going to meet. And then it comes down to everything from convenience to cost to the physical requirements of it. Some systems have a software system that allows for different devices to be used. For example, some systems will allow off-the-shelf printers to be used to print the paper. Some have proprietary devices. There are advantages and disadvantages to each of those. So essentially, we will look at all the different systems. And there are lots of people out there that are trying to create something and make the best determination about what's best for Georgia and what's most responsible for the citizens of Georgia, what's going to serve them best.
And the reason I'm asking is I don't like it personally when a vendor comes and says, this is what is great for you, and then somebody comes to me and says, this is the vendor we want, and we don't really get any insight into the process. Therefore, I would like to truly know what that process looks like so that we're not hamstrung later. And I'm also curious, in this procedure that you're going through, are you looking at something that would do a combination of the BMD rather and the optical scan system, primarily because of cost, but to make sure that seamlessly the vote is integrated smoothly, that whether I voted by optical scan or by BMD, my vote is seamlessly integrated into the overall vote count, because I'm assuming that different vendors would have a different way of making that happen.
Well, everything would have to conform to certification standards. So that's the first thing that's important, is it would meet the standards for operating in the under EAC and Georgia guidelines. So that's the first consideration. Everything else is I guess up for debate and up for examination. And one thing I should have mentioned before, in this process, I think it would be important to include county election officials, include a wide range of people that can evaluate this. I don't think this is something that would be done in a 30-minute closed-door meeting to say, okay, we got A and we got B, what's going on? There are some people that want to go back to pure paper without the ballot marking devices, where you just have the numbered your pencil, and because that way they feel more secure, and that's fine. There are some people that are trying to push the envelope to a more digital online system, which seems to be working against what common sentiment is. But there are people out there that are doing that. And it's always a balancing act of getting a system that is accessible, secure, accurate, reliable, and something the voters can access and feel comfortable with.
And then my understanding currently is not only were the voter database information available, but even the passwords for some of the supervisors were available in a non-secured environment in these databases. Can you address that?
I can talk a little bit about that. I believe you're talking about the incident at Kennesaw State University.
Yes, sir.
They have essentially, that was part of their online server. The system that operates the voting system and that generates that is an air-gapped offline system. So what was accessed was an online server. The server that actually operates and interacts with the voting system was never breached. So the old information that was on a server, which was certainly regrettable, which should not have happened, didn't really have anything to do with what was going on at the time. It was old information.
Okay. And finally, whenever a decision has been made, or perhaps we're narrowing it down to A, B, and C system, at what point would the legislative body be informed of the pros and the cons of all the systems? At what point will we get to weigh in and evaluate this? Because in the House, we're talking 180 different minds that would be looking at this, and that's a lot more minds than you would necessarily have. I mean, it's just at least another 180 people just in the House alone that could be looking at this. At what point will we be involved in that process?
I can't say exactly when that's going to happen, because again, there's not necessarily a roadmap. Like I said, we're starting to see what's out there. We're starting to look at things in a very general, holistic way. Obviously, anything that we would consider would probably have to conform to either current laws, or if we were considering this system, for example, that we're testing, and it's just a pilot. There's nothing specific about this system that makes it any better than the other systems that are out there. But we'd have to ask you to change the law to allow us to use it. So I would think you would be an integral part early on. Okay. But again, I don't have a date timeline when this is going to take place.
And I'm sorry, I did have one last question. Talking about audits, and of course we heard that in Virginia they were even having to rewrite the laws on being able to do an audit. Do you know what the laws currently are for being able to do an audit in Georgia, and do we even need to look at that to make sure that we can audit the elections?
Well, I think that's the will of the legislature, certainly. If they wanted to require an audit, they could certainly do that. And you could do that at a very high level or a lower level and base it on different criteria. So that's purely in the realm of the legislature.
But do you know if there's a law right now in the books about doing an audit?
There's not a law requiring an audit, and there are I'm not aware of any laws that specifically talk about audits other than what I mentioned early about the kind of the standard paper accounting to make sure that you've got the numbers that add up.
But we don't have a law that would preclude an audit?
No, ma'am, not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Chair recognizes Representative Turner.
Thank you again, Mr. Harvey. You mentioned the incident at Kennesaw State University, and I read the report, the incident report, their postmortem that they performed as a result of some of the alarming situations that they found there. And you mentioned that this server was air-gapped, meaning it wasn't connected to the internet. I want to make sure I explore the definition of that term. It was by itself, standalone.
No, what I meant to say, if I wasn't clear, is that the server that was accessed was connected to a network. There are other devices. There's a completely offline set of equipment that they use when working with the voting system.
And that system is not connected to the internet.
That's correct.
Now, in the incident report from Kennesaw State University, and I would recommend anybody on this committee and any legislator to read it, it was quite enlightening. It mentioned that there was a server that was kept in an unlocked room that anybody could access, including students, that if they knew it was there, they could just get access. Is that the server that we're talking about? That
I'm honestly not sure which that report is, server that report's
okay,
referring to.
Fair enough. Earlier, you were talking about the cost of the machines. How many machines do we currently have in Georgia? Do you have any idea?
Roughly 27,000.
27,000. Now, if we were to go to the DRE, we would basically be replacing those one for one.
If we're to go to the ballot marking device?
Yeah. To what's it called? The express vote system that you are currently piloting.
If we were to go to that, it's a little bit different. I think you have to do a slightly different calculation because while those are ballot marking devices, you then take that paper into a separate scanner. I think you would probably want a comparable number of ballot marking devices as you have DREs, but you would not need as many scanners. You could have one scanner for multiple ballot marking devices.
Okay.
And so I don't know that it's exactly a one for one, but it's relatively close, I think.
All right. So how much are the ballot marking devices?
To be honest, I haven't even looked at prices on those. Roughly,
what are they charging
roughly
us to run the
$2,000 to
pilot?
$3,000. I don't think there's any charge to run the pilot
Okay. So
that I'm aware of.
So we don't know what the cost is for the ballot marking devices.
I don't know exactly, no, sir. I haven't gotten
Okay.
I
I'm driving at something here, and I think it's kind of important.
Sure. I was just going to say, go ahead.
So how much do we have any idea how much the optical scanners are, either at this point?
The ones that are out there now?
That we be using if we were to go with this express vote solution?
They're several $1,000s each.
Several $1,000s
Yes,
each. If we don't know the cost, how do we come to the $100 million number?
Well, I said in excess of $100 million is the estimation. There have been people that have looked at it. I personally have not been in the cost looking at it yet. I've been much more interested in the operations, see how it works, and implementing it in this way. I have not gotten into the long-term projections of exactly the cost of it.
I do want to say this, and I'll say this for Mr. Harvey's. Thank you for that. Oftentimes when you're having this conversation, I work in the design and construction business. People want to avoid the cost discussion because they don't want to put a number down. He was reticent to share a number, but I think to give us an order of magnitude, we're talking in the range of more than $100 million. I know there's going to be implementation costs for staffing and things like that. I think this committee is well served to know that it's not $5 million or $20 million. or $1 billion. It's sort of 100 to 200 million, somewhere in that order of magnitude, I think. Is that's basically what you're representing. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
Okay. Proceed.
I hate to disagree with you, with the illustrious chairman of this committee, but in the media, when they're going to report what the answer to Jason or Representative Spencer's question, how much is the cost, they're going to say $100 million, or in excess of $100 million. And what we heard in expert testimony earlier in the day was that there is a more cost-effective solution in an Optiscan that actually would be ultimately more secure, so long as we as legislators do our job and make sure that we are requiring proper process in the form of audits. So I just want to, as we go through this process of exploring technology and in hand process, there is a sentiment. I know we're going into an election year to kind of go into hyperbole and blow everything up, and I'm trying to restrain myself because the amount of alarm that I have and hearing the testimony that we've heard today and that our elections could possibly be in doubt. But let's not throw numbers around when we don't have a basis for figuring out how we got to the 100 million. I mean, I'm in IT. It's my job. And so when I scope out a project, if I tell a client, I'm going to charge you $10,000 for this project, it's because I have an idea of how much I'm going to have to bill per hour to complete that project. If you throw a number out that says $100 million, I would expect that you would have some basis to figure out how you got to that number. Let's try to hold down the hyperbole through this, is what I'm saying. And we don't know what the cost is going to be until we have an RFP, an RFQ, and go through that process. And I would just offer that as counsel, as somebody who does RFPs, RFQs on a regular basis. That's all. Thank you.
Any further questions from members of the committee? I've got a question too, Mr. Harvey, if I could. And again, I think my counterpart to my left and I, we probably violently agree on this. I mean, it's one of these things of, you want to be careful with numbers. Sometimes you're afraid to say anything because you don't want to be castigated and held to it. So I just appreciate the discussion. We're trying to wrestle with this. I would say this, and I don't know, is Casey from Georgia Tech? She was in here earlier. I don't know if she's here. We built, by the way, as a legislature, we built a cutting-edge building. It was actually brought online in 2015 at Georgia Tech. It's the Environmental Biosystems Building. It was had a little private money in it, but it was a cutting-edge, LEED Platinum, sustainable building. It was an $87 million purchase for the state of Georgia to do biosystems, interdisciplinary biosystems research with Georgia Tech folks and industry, because we believe that the biotech research space is important for Georgia. I say that to say that just gives you a perspective. We're buying $50 to $90 million buildings in Georgia when they're really important. If you set that aside and ask the question parenthetically, how does our election system stack up in importance relative to buildings we build? I'm not criticizing the building. I'm simply saying in perspective, even if it is, I know Representative Turner's concerned if this bogey could be represented as this pricey, unreachable cost, and I respect the concern, but I say relative to this is just, I guess, me saying this parenthetically, I think relative to what we do as a state, if we believe that it was important for the state of Georgia to spend $100 or even $200 million to fix this, I don't think, from my perspective, and from the perspective of being honored to represent the people of House District 35, I don't think the people of House District 35 think that's an unachievable number if the integrity of our voting system is in the balance. So I would just say, let's talk about what's best for Georgia. I think the cost question is an important question, but it's a separate question. I think getting to the root of what is best is what we're here for. So this is just part of this vigorous back and forth. And That's just my perspective from members of the committee and the public, and we can talk about it moving forward. But I wouldn't be scared at numbers. We'll make good decisions as a state with the stewardship of our resources, but let's try to look at what best practices might be. To that point, Mr. Harvey, if you were in a position, you don't have to answer this question, but if we were having to replace our existing DRE systems, and we had the chance to replace them in kind, all 27,000 of them, get brand new systems with a 10-year warranty or whatever, or could replace them with a system that had a kind of a BMD thing where you're putting the ballot in, you interact with a screen, but it does print out a hard copy that you could then OptiScan in. Yeah, I've heard it said that they're roughly order of magnitude the same price. Would it be your recommendation perhaps or let me ask, whether it's your recommendation or the recommendation of other states, new states who've been making new technology purchases, have they been buying in the last 5 years or last 3 years electronic only systems, or are they moving to something that produces a manual, reproducible, auditable ballot?
They're moving towards the ballot marking devices, clearly.
Okay. Is there any state in the last 2 or 3 years that have bought electronic only systems new?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Thank you. That answers my questions. Any other questions from members of the committee for Mr. Harvey? I so thank you for being here today. I know that you didn't have to be here. It was kind for your time and being willing to take hard questions to the committee.
My pleasure.
Appreciate you being with. If you can stick around, maybe listen. There may be another question too that comes up. We are at high noon. It's 12 o'clock. We are gonna wrap up early. I know there's a lot of passionate opinions about this, and what I don't want to do is I don't want to have a good committee meeting devolve into something we wouldn't be proud of. Having said that, is there anybody here in the audience, if given 60 seconds to stand in your place where you are, is restraining ourselves to 60 seconds worth it, or should we just not do that and adjourn the committee meeting? What's the sense of the group? Think it's worth it? Let me ask this, can we constrain ourselves to 60 seconds standing in our place? Because I'm to be in the awkward spot that if anyone goes over and doesn't want to respect that, then we're in a place where I got to adjourn the meeting, and then we're on YouTube and it goes bad, right? What's the sense? Do we Mr. Harvey, and you're welcome to stay or to take a seat. What I would do, we would do it in a sort of a rapid fire format. I would just you'd stand where you are, you'd say your name, and I'd give you, unfortunately, I'm going to have to put you on the clock to do this. Is it okay to put people on the clock? Is that okay? Yes. Does anyone here, raise your hand, does anyone here object, anybody, does anyone object to everybody being put on the clock? You object to that?
Could we give our time to one person instead of using our 90 minutes?
No, ma'am. It's 60 seconds, one person. That's all we can do. But I want. There's a lot of passion about this, and this is the people's house. So I want to give people a chance to be heard. The representatives have been heard, I think, in a very vigorous discussion. Okay. Could you raise your hand if you'd like to be heard for 60 seconds? Okay. I want you people to stand up, please. And only you, okay? I'm going to go around, we're going to do a rapid fire. I don't want you to approach the mic. I want you to stand in your place if you could. And I'm going to recognize you speak for 60 seconds if that's okay. Any questions, any concerns? Raise your hand if you have a complaint about that process.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
I have about 5 minutes of information regarding to Georgia audits as well as Georgia costs. I would like to share with the committee, but that would take more than a minute. If that's not possible.
Mr. Favorito, I can share it with the committee. I'll be glad to do that. I'm going to give you 60 seconds, and I will start with you, sir. You're on. Mr. Favorito.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the questions I think that we need to get answered today, I'm not going to make a statement, but what I was hoping to hear from Chris Harvey was, why were the elections data left exposed on a public web server? We didn't get an answer to that question. That included everything, the databases, the voter registration database, voting files, everything has been exposed. The second question is, how long was that data exposed? We believe it's been exposed for years. The third question that I'd like to have heard an answer to is, what is the procedure in which the counties get that data? Are they getting it from the internet and they're not telling us? I've asked 3 different counties. I've gotten 3 different answers to that question, which is strange. So those are some of the questions that I would like to have seen answered today. And those, if we, the public, had got a chance to ask these questions, we could have, I think, gotten some better answers than what we got from Director Harvey.
Well, Mr. Fribber, you have asked the question. We'll take notes on that. I appreciate your sharing that. And again, I think the quality of this is not the things we say, but the questions we ask. So if you have questions, put them before the committee. It'll be part of this process moving forward.
Got it.
Thank you. Ma'am, to my right, could you give me your name, and I'll let you speak first.
Yes, Becky Arrington. I'm with Fair Election Advocacy. In particular, I am interested to, what is the short term? We've got elections in November. We know we can't do anything most likely with that. I want the committee to consider a stopgap measure to 2018. 2018 is a huge, we've got the governor's race. Right now, the citizens of Georgia do not feel safe in their voting processes. And so I urge the committee to find out, even to go get some Optiscan machines from the used ones, that we are able to do some sort of an in-between. So that's what I would ask for you to do. The other thing I would request is that you look very carefully, get a committee involved, not just the Secretary of State's office, in terms of running a variety of pilot programs, because there's a lot of different options out there.
Ms. Arrington, thank you very much. Yes, ma'am. What's your name? And
My name is Susan Cannell, resident of Cobb County. I had really a clarification question, which is the pilot program. There appears to be 2 different systems. There appears to be a completely electronic system that has a piece of paper attached where the computer system will mark the paper. And he suggested a hybrid system where, for those disabled voters, that type of machine was used, and for the majority of voters, a paper ballot was actually marked, and that the scanning equipment could scan both. The pilot project and the prices that they talked about weren't clarified. Which are they? Is the pilot project every voter gets one of the machines? Yes. And are we looking at the hybrid system where all the able-bodied voters are given a paper ballot, and the scanning equipment and the electronic machines are used for disabled voters, and all of that scanned into an Optiscanner?
thank you. Ms. Connor, I think I can say this is more of a preliminary pilot. If we were doing a real statewide pilot rollout, it would be in multiple regions. It would be done. I think, listen, I'm not speaking for the state of Georgia. I'm just saying that we could be doing nothing, or we could be doing what's happening in Conyers as sort of a test. So we're not going to debate it. I'm just telling you, I don't think this is the state of Georgia's expression of what a full-up, robust pilot would be.
I'm just asking if the one that's in the process is all machines or the combination. That's all machines.
We can get you that answer. I don't have the answer. We'd be glad to talk about that offline and get that answer for you. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Name?
Peggy Barlett, and I'm resident of Fulton County.
Okay.
I very much am concerned, and much more so today. Thank you for this very informative and very helpful session. I am not comfortable being a resident of one of the last 5 or 6 states to be addressing the problem of hacking. And the question that I would ask is, why are we so slow in making change? I secondly would like to say I really appreciate and support both what you, Chairman Sessler, and what Representative Turner basically indicated, which is that the cost to us of losing trust in our elections is much higher than any of the figures stated today. We must move forward. And lastly, I very much support this combination that we heard today of a paper ballot together with machines for disabled or persons who choose them. I personally voted this last election in a precinct which used to have 2,000 people on the rolls, and there was very short lines, and switch to having 12,000 people and very long lines. I'm very attracted to something that would let us all move through that process more quickly. I really hope that some people were not deterred by the fact they couldn't even pull into the parking lot, and I really hope that we can move toward a safer, fairer election next time. Not in 2020, but the next time.
Thank you, Ms. Burnett. Appreciate you being here today. Thanks for your words. Okay, next in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Rhonda Fox.
Hey, Rhonda.
Resident in DeKalb County. My questions are along these same lines. It seems like we've had the same system for about 15 years, which no matter what technology you're talking about, we know that's old. And being one of 5 states who still haven't changed and caught up is extremely concerning. So the person who was speaking was saying, we've just started this process. That seems real late to the game. And we've already got a test pilot going in Conyers, which is great. But why aren't we in it with everything we've got to make a change here? That sounds to me, it feels to me like that experimentation is vendor-driven rather than the people who are making the decision coming up with alternatives and saying, we know there are 5 alternatives, let's do a good test. The next election, have all 5 of these that we've approved happening in different places, do the evaluation, boom, make the change. And you are absolutely right, $100 million is nothing if that's what it's going to take to have election integrity and to ensure voters that their vote's going to count.
Ms. Fox, thank you. Thanks for your presentation. Right. Sir.
My name's R.J. Hadley, and I want to ask you, Chairman, I'm actually going to be on the ballot as a candidate in 2018 for Secretary of State. So if you don't feel it's appropriate for me to say anything.
You got 60 seconds. Yes, sir. Happy to.
First, I want to say thank you for allowing just this moment where the public can give its input. I think that's going to be the important piece as someone who will be candidate for Secretary of State on that ballot. If there is any question about that election, any of us as candidates, we're going to be concerned about that. So I think opportunities like this to let the public speak as often as possible is important. I think the points on cost were very on point, and thank you for making that. What I have seen, especially on this system that we're testing, there are a number of cost proposals out there from Ohio, from Michigan, from Maryland, that people can see, and you can actually see the breakdown on cost if anyone on the committee wants to do that. Finally, I would say that no one is talking about it, but there are other states, although they are in the minority, that do look at vote by mail only as an option. And again, when you're looking at, I know raw numbers that are out there, $100 million, but give the public all the options that are out there. I see you shaking your head and I understand, but I'm just saying, as you have these public discussions, give the public all the options that are out there. That's all I say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hadley. Yes, ma'am. What's your name?
My name is Isabel Hidalgo. I'm from Fulton County. Thank you for doing this very much. I'm here as a concerned citizen, and I'm very bothered thinking what kind of a bubble you have to be in to not know that there's a world concern about hacking of elections. There's a national concern, and there's a local concern, which is even greater. All of us were part of Georgia's 6th election. All of us have doubts and concerns of what happened in this election. We are in the eyes of the world, and the country are on us. I have an understanding that our machines have been rated F- for years by authorities, and we're still discussing nitty-gritties and things that look so vague. I'm very worried. I'm about to start a campaign asking people only to vote by mail, where there will be a verifiable ballot. Countries like England and countries like Australia and Canada, with not necessarily simple elections, go to hand-counted paper ballots, and they use a bifurcation system, which separates candidates that are counted on the first day and referendums during the following week. Paper ballots is what the whole world is doing since Russia hacked Ukraine. Why are we playing and discussing things that are making us waste time? And we have serious elections in 2018. I don't want my governor to come elected in a hacked system and not us rely on the system that elected
Thank you.
And I'm very grateful. Her, thank you.
Thank you for your passion. Yeah.
I have serious doubts it's gonna be a her if we don't change things. Thank you.
And finally, our last speaker. Yes, ma'am. 60 seconds.
My name is Donna Price. I am the director of Georgians for Verified Voting. I really appreciate what you've done for this presentation today, and I'm very impressed with the work that you're doing. What I wanted to address, there were some questions about using the ballot marking devices. Those devices, of course, the vendor does want to, does represent those as being used for all voters, but they're designed and they're EAC certified for ADA HAVA accessibility access. So the problem about the 7 candidates on a screen, that actually if a blind person is voting on that, using that touch screen device with headphones, it's not a problem to have that the candidates are listed in the audio. Maryland ran into quite a problem, and candidates threatened lawsuits because they were talking about using the ballot marking devices for their first primary when they rolled into the
Ms. Price, thank you.
ballot optical scan system to use that ballot marking device for everyone. It's actually for people who are able voters. They can use pencil, hand marked on paper ballot. They all put it in the same DS200.
Ms. Price, thank you. Appreciate you being here today, and this will not be the last conversation that's had about this issue. Thanks for being involved. I have one more person that stood up. Yes, ma'am, last one.
My name's Elizabeth Shackelford. I live in DeKalb County. I wanted to clarify, I used to work in IT too, and that shades a couple of things. One is I think we have to be really crystal clear about terminology. The BMD system also uses an optical scanner. BMD is touchscreen. It's not that different from the DREs we have now, and any computer system is hackable. The paper system also uses optical scan. There's no such thing as an optical scan system. There's paper and optical scan or BMD and optical scan. When a self-professed geek tells us that the state-of-the-art is paper, it hurts him to have to admit that paper is far more secure than anything technological. And I've done some research in this area, and I kind of disagree that there's a trend of moving towards BMDs. And I believe Mr. Epstein mentioned also that the greater trend is moving to paper, which is considered the state-of-the-art. And on the whole business about being on the internet, off the internet, any computer, virtually any computer, you have to work very hard and be a technical person to prevent a computer from being hackable. I don't care when people say,
Yes, ma'am.
it's not on the internet. At one point or other, it's attached to a network and therefore hackable.
Ms. Shackelford, thank you very much. We are at 12:20, and we have wrapped up our agenda for the day. Thank you for being here. I think this is an important conversation to be had. This is a technology discussion that we knew we would not solve today, but our goal was to begin to ask questions about the technology around this important issue of voting. And with that, I thank you for being part of this. We stand adjourned.